The wind carried the scent of burnt olive wood. Where a temple once stood, only the shadow of its columns remained, trembling across the ash. Bronze shields lay face down, still warm from hands that no longer held them. A single sandal, half buried in dust. A child's bracelet crushed beside a fallen lyre. The music of the city had ended, but its echo clung to the smoke. They said the battle was over, but for those left breathing, the silence was the beginning of another war. Down the broken streets, torches moved like serpents. Men in crested helmets shouted names, not of enemies but of prizes. Every door opened to fear. Every shadow held a breath that dared not move. On the steps of a ruined house, a woman clutched her veil as if it could make her invisible. Her eyes did not seek mercy, only the faces of those who might remember her name. Above the city, the banners of the conquerors fluttered, red, gold, and blackened with soot. To them this was glory. To her it was the hour when the gods turned away. When the gates fell, they said the city was taken. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The city was measured in bodies, and women were the final count. They came from across the sea, 1,000 ships, each carrying men who believed the gods had chosen them to conquer. Their oars split the dawn like teeth. They called it glory, they called it justice. But what they sought beneath their bronze and prayers was possession. To a Greek warrior, victory was not an ending, it was a counting. When the city fell, its gold was tallied, its herds counted, its men cut down. And what remained, the women, were divided as spoils, tokens of the hero's honor. Even the great kings took their share. The higher the rank, the finer the captive. They called it gerus, the prize due to valor. It was not love nor cruelty, but law. A woman was weight, worth, and witness. To possess her was to proclaim your triumph. To lose her was to lose face before your peers. In the dark heart of every feast after a conquest, she sat behind the laughter, silent, uncounted. The songs of bards would praise the hero's might, but none would speak of the trembling hands that poured their wine. Among them were names that would outlive empires. Helen, whose beauty became the pretext for 10 years of slaughter. Briseis, the girl torn from her home, whose capture kindled the wrath of Achilles. Cassandra, the prophet who saw the ruin before it came, yet was condemned never to be believed. Their stories were not exceptions, they were the rule. Each one a reflection of a custom carved into the bones of civilization, that the measure of a man's glory was the ruin of another's home. As night fell over the camps, fires flickered on the horizon, not as light, but as mirrors. In each flame, a shadow stirred, and it had a woman's face. When dawn came, the victors sang hymns to the gods, and the women learned the silence that follows every victory. When the walls gave way, the wind screamed louder than the people. Stone crumbled, fire ran like water, and the sound of bronze striking bronze filled the streets. It was not war anymore. It was hunger wearing armor. A soldier kicked down a door. Inside, the smell of smoke and blood met the scent of crushed myrrh. A woman clutched a child, whispering a god's name. Any god, every god. The only answer was the drag of sandals on the marble floor. Outside, the conquerors shouted names, counting, sorting, claiming. To them this was order. To her it was the world being written over. Helen stood by a window that no longer had glass. Her beauty, the curse and the cause, gleamed against the ruin. Men fought to possess her, to prove themselves worthy of what she never asked to be. In her eyes flickered the reflection of ships burning, her legacy written in fire. She was not a prize, but a mirror showing them what they truly worshipped. Desire dressed as destiny. Briseis did not scream when they took her. Her village was already gone, the sky already red. Achilles found her not by name, but by silence. He lifted her face and saw nothing but the echo of his own violence. Later, when Agamemnon would demand her as his share, Achilles' pride would burn hotter than Troy itself. Two kings, one woman, neither seeing her as anything but proof of their worth. And yet, in the quiet of night, she remembered the songs of her people, humming them beneath her breath, the only thing she could still own. Cassandra ran through the temple barefoot, hair unbound, shouting warnings no one would heed. She had foreseen this night, and still they called her mad. When the Greeks dragged her from the altar of Athena, she clung to the statue's foot, tears mixing with dust. Agamemnon himself would claim her, the prophetess of doom, becoming his prize of conquest. And the gods, silent as the dead, watched their own prophecy fulfilled. By morning the smoke had thinned, the sea glimmered calm and cruel. The victors stood among the ruins, dividing their spoils: gold, livestock, ivory, and women. The songs that would be sung of this day would praise courage and triumph. None would mention the cries muffled behind broken doors. In the language of the victors, victory was masculine, suffering always feminine. And somewhere beyond the ashes, a whisper drifted through the air, not prayer, not curse, just memory refusing to die. Night settled over the camp like a lid over a jar. The fires had burned low, the laughter of men gave way to the slow breathing of sleep. Beyond the walls of tents, the captives sat in silence, a silence so deep it seemed older than the stars. Briseis traced her name in the dirt, only to watch the wind erase it. It was safer that way. Names could be taken too. She learned the rhythm of footsteps, when the guards changed, when Achilles' tent went dark, when the world was briefly still. In those moments, she sang under her breath, fragments of a song from her village. It had no words now, only hums. But even that was rebellion, because song meant memory, and memory was the one thing they could not chain. Helen sat in a chamber lined with foreign silks. Each thread died in the grief of others. Men still called her the most beautiful in the world, but beauty had become her prison, a weapon she never forged. Each compliment, each gaze, was another shackle. When she looked into a polished bronze mirror, she no longer saw her reflection. Only the ghosts of those who had died because she existed. Sometimes she wished she had been born plain, forgotten, invisible, but history does not forget what it can possess. Cassandra could not sleep. Her visions still came, flickering like embers beneath her eyelids. She saw a future drenched in the same smoke as the past, Agamemnon's homecoming, the knife waiting in his hall, the blood that would stain yet another threshold. She smiled through her tears. Even prophecy was a curse when no one listened. Among the women, she was the only one who still spoke to the gods, not in plea, but in accusation. "You gave men the glory of conquest," she whispered, "but to us you gave remembrance, which is the crueler gift." The nights stretched on. In the camp, the women learned to read silence, the shuffle of a guard's sandals, the sigh of a friend asleep beside them, the tiny rustle that meant dawn was near. Sometimes they braided each other's hair, not for beauty, but for order, a ritual to remind themselves they were still human, each knot a prayer. "I am still here. I still remember." When the sun rose, the men sang hymns of victory again. The women carried water, mended tents, smiled when ordered to, but in the way they met each other's eyes, quiet, steady, unbroken, there was something the conquerors never noticed, the smallest ember of defiance. They had taken their homes, their names, their gods, but they could not take the stories forming in silence. And in that silence, something ancient began to breathe again, a promise that memory itself would outlive the victors. Centuries passed, the ashes of Troy turned to dust, and dust to myth. What men could not bear to remember, they began to sing. The poets called it glory, 10 years of war for one woman's face. They carved the names of heroes into marble, but the names of the women faded like pigment in the sun, and yet their shadows remained. Helen became the spark of 1,000 verses. Pain was replaced with beauty, guilt with desire. The storytellers remade her, not as a captive, but as a temptress. They said she bewitched kings, that she caused the ruin of men. But the truth was simpler. She was never the flame, only the mirror that caught it. Her legend survived because it suited men to remember her that way, beautiful enough to blame, distant enough to forgive. Briseis was reduced to a few lines in an epic. Her tears became background to a hero's rage. In every retelling, her silence deepened. But sometimes scholars find her name carved faintly on a pottery shard, as if someone somewhere wanted the world to know she had existed, not as a trophy, but as a woman who sang softly into the dark. Cassandra, doomed to see and never be believed, became the voice of every truth ignored. Her curse turned into a metaphor, her agony into a lesson about disbelief and prophecy, and yet within those parables you can still hear the faint tremor of her scream, the sound of someone who once saw everything burn and could do nothing to stop it. Time polished their suffering into legend, their names into symbols, their lives into warning tales told in temples and theaters. But beneath the marble, beneath the layers of song and ceremony, the truth still hums like a heartbeat in the ground, that each of them once stood in the smoke of a fallen city, breathing, fearing, remembering, and in every era that sings of heroes, there lingers the echo of a voice asking softly, "Who tells the story of the conquered?" The answer has never been silence. It is the echo you still hear, in the tremble of the lyre, in the whisper of a woman's name, in the shadow between verses where history dares not look. The story of the Greek wars was written by men and sung for centuries by their sons. But between the lines of bronze and glory, there is another Iliad, one whispered, not sung. It begins not with heroes but with hands. Hands that gathered children, hands that carried the dead, hands that once wove linen, now bound in chains. History remembers Achilles' rage, Agamemnon's pride, Odysseus' cunning. But who remembers the quiet endurance of those who survived them? Who names the women who rebuilt what the gods allowed to burn? In every ruin lies a choice, to gaze upon the stones and see conquest, or to listen and hear the echoes of the conquered. The Greeks believed that memory was sacred, that to forget was a second death. And so perhaps this is where remembrance begins again, not in the songs of heroes, but in the soft persistence of their shadows. Helen, Briseis, Cassandra, their faces blurred by time, their voices half lost, and yet they remain, not as myths, but as mirrors, each reflecting the truth that empire and desire are never far apart, and that glory, stripped of mercy, is only another word for ruin. So, if their stories still echo, let it be because we chose to listen.